The Riverside, Chaucer. By Larry D. Benson. General Prologue. When April with its sweet-smelling showers has pierced the drought of March to the root, and bathed every vein of the plants in such liquid, by which power the flower is created, when the west wind also with its sweet breath in every wood and field has breathed life into the tender new leaves, and the young sun has run half its course in Aries, and small fowls make melody, those that sleep all the night with open eyes, so nature incites them in their hearts. Then folk long to go on pilgrimages, and professional pilgrims to seek foreign shores, to distant shrines, known in various lands, and specially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they travel, to seek the holy blessed martyr, who helped them when they were sick. It happened that in that season on one day, in Southwark at the Tabard Inn as I lay, ready to go on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with a very devout spirit, at night had come into that hostelry, well 29 in a company of various sorts of people, by chance fallen in fellowship, and they were all pilgrims, who intended to ride toward Canterbury. The bedrooms and the stables were spacious, and we were well accommodated in the best way. And in brief, when the sun was gone to rest, I had so spoken with every one of them, that I was of their fellowship straightway, and made agreement to rise early, to take our way where I will tell you. But none the less, while I have time and opportunity, before I proceed further in this tale, it seems to me in accord with reason, to tell you all the circumstances of each of them, as it seemed to me, and who they were, and of what social rank, and also what clothing that they were in. And at a night then will I first begin. A knight there was, and that one was a worthy man, who from the time that he first began to ride out, he loved chivalry, fidelity and good reputation, generosity and courtesy. He was very worthy in his lord's war, and for that he had ridden, no man farther, as well in Christendom as in heathen lands, and was ever honoured for his worthiness. He was at Alexandria when it was won. He had sat very many times in the place of honour, above knights of all nations in Prussia. He had campaigned in Lithuania and in Russia. No Christian man of his rank so often. Also he had been in Grenada at the siege of Algeciras, and had ridden in Morocco. He was at Iash and at Atalia, when they were won, and in the Mediterranean. He had been at many a noble expedition. He had been at 15 mortal battles, and fought for our faith at Tlemcen, 3 times in formal duels, and each time slain his foe. This same worthy knight had also been at one time with the Lord of Balat, against another heathen in Turkey, and evermore he had an outstanding reputation. And although he was brave, he was prudent, and of his deportment as meek as a maid. He never yet said any rude word in all his life unto any sort of person. He was a truly perfect, noble knight. But to tell you of his clothing, his horses were good, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a tunic of coarse cloth, all stained with rust by his coat of mail, for he was recently come back from his expedition, and went to do his pilgrimage. With him there was his son, a young squire, a lover and a lively bachelor, with locks curled as if they had been laid in a curler. He was 20 years of age, I guess. Of his stature, he was of moderate height, and wonderfully agile, and of great strength. And he had been for a time on a cavalry expedition, in Flanders, in Artois, and Picardy, and conducted himself well, for so little a space of time, in hope to stand in his lady's good graces. He was embroidered, as if it were a mead, all full of fresh flowers, white and red. Singing he was, or fluting, all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. His gown was short, with long and wide sleeves. He well knew how to sit on horse and handsomely ride. He knew how to make songs and well compose the words, joust and also dance, and well draw and write. He loved so passionately that at night time he slept no more than does a nightingale. Courteous he was, humble, and willing to serve, and carved before his father at the table. He The knight had a yeoman and no more servants. At that time, for it pleased him so to travel. And he, the yeoman, was clad in coat and hood of green, a sheaf of peacock arrows, bright and keen. He carried under his belt very properly. He well knew how to care for his equipment as a yeoman should. His arrows did not fall short because of drooping feathers. And in his hand he carried a mighty bow. He had a close-cropped head, with a brown face. He well knew all the practice of woodcraft. He wore an elegant archer's wrist guard upon his arm, and by his side a sword and a small shield, and on that other side an elegant dagger, well ornamented and sharp as the point of a spear. A Christopher medal of bright silver on his breast. He carried a horn, the shoulder strap was green. He was a forester, truly, as I guess. There was also a nun, a prioress, who was very simple and modest in her smiling. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Loy, and she was called Madame Eglantine. She sang the divine service very well, intoned in her nose in a very polite manner, and she spoke French very well and elegantly, in the manner of Stratford at the Bow, for French of Paris was to her unknown. At meals she was well taught indeed. She let no morsel fall from her lips, nor wet her fingers deep in her sauce. She well knew how to carry a morsel to her mouth, and take good care that no drop fell upon her breast. Her greatest pleasure was in good manners. She wiped her upper lip so clean that in her cup there was seen no tiny bit of grease. When she had drunk her drink, she reached for her food in a very seemly manner, and surely she was of excellent deportment, and very pleasant, and amiable in demeanour, and she took pains to imitate the manners of court, and to be dignified in behaviour, and to be considered worthy of reverence. But to speak of her moral sense, she was so charitable and so compassionate. She would weep, if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled. She had some small hounds that she fed with roasted meat, or milk and fine white bread. But sorely she wept if one of them were dead, or if someone smote it smartly with a stick. And all was feeling and tender heart. Her wimple was pleated in a very seemly manner, her nose well formed, her eyes grey as glass, her mouth very small, and moreover soft and red. But surely she had a fair forehead. It was almost 9 inches broad, I believe. For, certainly, she was not undergrown. Her cloak was very well made, as I was aware. About her arm she bore of small coral a set of beads, adorned with large green beads, and thereon hung a brooch of very bright gold, on which there was first written an A with a crown, and after love conquers all. She had another nun with her, who was her secretary, and 3 priests. There was a monk, an extremely fine one, an outrider, a monk with business outside the monastery, who loved hunting, a virile man, qualified to be an abbot. He had very many fine horses in his stable, and when he rode, one could hear his bridle jingle in a whistling wind as clear, and also as loud as does the chapel bell, where this lord was prior of the subordinate monastery, the rule of St. Maurice or of St. Benedict, because it was old and somewhat strict. This same monk let old things pass away, and followed the broader customs of modern times. He gave not a plucked hen for that text that says that hunters are not holy men, nor that a monk, when he is heedless of rules, is like a fish that is out of water. This is to say, a monk out of his cloister. But he considered that same text not worth an oyster, and I said his opinion was good. Why should he study, and make himself crazy, always to pore upon a book in the cloister, or work with his hands, and labour, as Augustine commands? How shall the world be served? Let Augustine have his work reserved to him. Therefore he was indeed a vigorous horseman. He had greyhounds as swift as fowl in flight. Of tracking and of hunting for the hare was all his pleasure, by no means would he refrain from it. I saw his sleeves lined at the hand with squirrel fur, and that the finest in the land, and to fasten his hood under his chin, he had a very skilfully made pin of gold. There was an elaborate knot in the larger end. His head was bald, which shone like any glass, and his face did too, as if he had been rubbed with oil. He was a very plump lord and in good condition. His eyes were prominent, and rolling in his head, which gleamed like a furnace under a cauldron. His boots supple, his horse in excellent condition. Now certainly, he was a handsome ecclesiastical dignitary. He was not pale as a tormented spirit. A fat swan loved he best of any roast. His saddle horse was as brown as is a berry. There was a friar, a pleasure-loving and merry one. A limiter, with an assigned territory, a very solemn man. In all the 4 orders of friars is no one that knows so much of sociability and elegant speech. He had made very many a marriage of young women at his own cost. He was a noble supporter of his order. Very well beloved and familiar was he with landowners everywhere in his country, and also with worthy women of the town, for he had power of confession, as he said himself, more than a parish priest, for he was licensed by his order. He heard confession very sweetly, and his absolution was pleasant. He was a lenient man in giving penance, where he knew he would have a good gift. For to give to a poor order of friars is a sign that a man is well confessed. For if he gave, he, the friar, dared to assert, he knew that a man was repentant. For many a man is so hard in his heart, he cannot weep, although he painfully suffers. Therefore instead of weeping and prayers, one may give silver to the poor friars. His hood was always stuffed full of knives and pins, to give to fair wives. And certainly he had a merry voice. He well knew how to sing and play on a rote, string instrument. He absolutely took the prize for reciting ballads. His neck was white as a lily flower. Furthermore he was strong as a champion fighter. He knew the taverns well in every town, and every innkeeper and barmaid, better than a leper or a beggar woman. For unto such a worthy man as he, it was not suitable, in view of his official position, to have acquaintance with sick lepers. It is not respectable, it cannot be profitable, to deal with any such poor people, but all with rich people and sellers of victuals. And everywhere, where profit should arise, he was courteous and graciously humble. There was no man anywhere so capable of such work. He was the best beggar in his house, and he gave a certain fee for his grant of begging rights. None of his brethren came there in his territory, for though a widow had not a shoe, so pleasant was his in the beginning, yet he would have a farthing before he went away. His total profit was much more than his proper income, and he knew how to frolic, as if he were indeed a pup. He knew how to be much help on days for resolving disputes, for there he was not like a cloistered monk, with a threadbare cope, like a poor scholar, but he was like a master of arts or a pope. Of wide, expensive cloth was his short cloak, which was round as a bell fresh from the clothes-press. Somewhat he lisped, for his affectation, to make his English sweet upon his tongue, and in his harping, when he had sung, his eyes twinkled in his head exactly, as do the stars in the frosty night. This worthy friar was called Hubert. There was a merchant with a forked beard, wearing party-coloured cloth, and proudly he sat on his horse. Upon his head, he wore a Flemish beaver hat. His boots were buckled handsomely, and elegantly. His opinions he spoke very solemnly, concerning always the increase of his profits. He wanted the sea to be guarded at all costs, between Middelburg, Holland, and Orwell, England. He well knew how to deal in foreign currencies. This worthy man employed his wit very well. There was no one who knew that he was in debt. He was so dignified in managing his affairs, with his buying and selling and with his financial deals. Truly, he was a worthy man indeed. But, to say the truth, I do not know what men call him. There was also a clerk, scholar, from Oxford, who long before had begun the study of logic. His horse was as lean as is a rake, and he was not very fat, I affirm, but looked emaciated, and moreover abstemious. His short overcoat was very threadbare, for he had not yet obtained an ecclesiastical living, nor was he worldly enough to take secular employment, for he would rather have at the head of his bed 20 books, bound in black or red, of Aristotle and his philosophy, than rich robes, or a fiddle, or an elegant psaltery. But even though he was a philosopher, Nevertheless he had but little gold in his strongbox. But all that he could get from his friends, he spent on books and on learning, and diligently did pray for the souls of those who gave him the wherewithal to attend the schools. He took most care and paid most heed to study. He spoke not one word more than was needed, and that was said with due formality and respect, and short and lively and full of elevated content. His speech was consonant with moral virtue, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach. A sergeant of the law, high-ranking attorney, prudent and wise, who often had been at the porch of St. Paul's, where lawyers gather, was also there, very rich in superior qualities. He was judicious and of great dignity. He seemed such, his words were so wise. He was very often judge in the court of assizes, by royal appointment, and with full jurisdiction. For his knowledge and for his excellent reputation, he had many grants of yearly income. There was nowhere so great a land buyer. In fact, all was unrestricted possession to him. His purchasing could not be invalidated. There was nowhere so busy a man as he, and yet he seemed busier than he was. He had in year books all the cases and decisions that from the time of King William have occurred. Furthermore, he knew how to compose and draw up a legal document, so that no one could find a flaw in his writing. And he knew every statute completely by heart. He rode but simply in a parti-colored coat, girded with a belt of silk, with small stripes. I tell no longer tale of his clothing. A franklin was in his company. His beard was white as a daisy. As to his temperament, he was dominated by the humour blood. He well loved a bit of bread dipped in wine in the morning. His custom was always to live in delight, for he was Epicurus' own son, who held the opinion that pure pleasure was truly perfect happiness. He was a householder, and a great one at that. He was Saint Julian, patron of hospitality, in his country. His bread, his ale, was always of the same good quality. Nowhere was there any man better stocked with wine. His house was never without baked pies, of fish and meat, and that so plentiful, that in his house it snowed with food and drink, of all the dainties that men could imagine, in accord with the various seasons of the year. So he varied his midday meal and his supper. He had very many fat partridges in pens, and many a bream and many a pike in his fish pond. Woe was his cook unless his sauce was hotly spiced and sharp, and ready all his cooking equipment. In his hall his dining table always stood covered with tablecloth, and ready all the long day. He presided as lord and sire at court sessions. He was a member of parliament many times. A dagger and a purse all of silk hung at his belt, white as morning milk. He had been a sheriff, and an auditor of taxes. There was nowhere such a worthy landowner. A haberdasher and a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, and a tapestry maker, and they were all clothed in one livery, of a solemn and a great parish guild. Their equipment was adorned all freshly and new. Their knives were not mounted with brass, but entirely with silver, wrought very neatly and well. Their belts and their purses every bit. Each of them well seemed a solid citizen, to sit on a dais in a city hall. Every one of them, for the wisdom that he knows, was suitable to be an alderman. For they had enough possessions and income, and also their wives would well assent to it. And otherwise certainly they would be to blame. It is very fine to be called my lady, and go to feasts on holiday eves heading the procession, and have a gown with a train royally carried. A cook they had with them for the occasion, to boil the chickens with the marrow bones, and tart poudre marchant and galingale, spices. He well knew how to judge a draught of London ale. He knew how to roast, and boil, and broil, and fry, make stews, and well bake a pie. But it was a great harm, as it seemed to me, that he had an open sore on his shin. As for white pudding, he made that of the best quality. A shipman was there, dwelling far in the west. For all I know, he was from Dartmouth. He rode upon a cart horse, in so far as he knew how, in a gown of woolen cloth, that reached to the knee. He had a dagger hanging on a cord, about his neck, down under his arm. The hot summer had made his hue all brown. And certainly, he was a boon companion. He had drawn very many a draught of wine. While coming from Bordeaux, while the merchant slept, he had no concern for a scrupulous conscience. If he fought and had the upper hand, he sent them home by water to every land, they walked the plank. But of his skill to reckon well his tides, his currents, and his perils near at hand, his harbours, and positions of his moon, his navigation, there was none other such from Hull to Cartagena, Spain. He was bold and prudent in his undertakings. His beard had been shaken by many a tempest. He knew all the harbours, how they were, from Gotland to the Cape of Finisterre, and every inlet in Brittany and in Spain. His ship was called the Magdalene. With us there was a doctor of medicine. In all this world there was no one like him, to speak of medicine, and of surgery, for he was instructed in astronomy. He took care of his patient very many times, in astronomically suitable hours by use of his natural science. He well knew how to calculate the planetary position of his astronomical talismans for his patient. He knew the cause of every malady, were it of hot, or cold, or moist, or dry elements, and where they were engendered, and by what bodily fluid. He was a truly perfect practitioner. The cause known, and the source of his patient's harm, straightway he gave the sick man his remedy. He had his apothecaries all ready, to send him drugs and his electuaries, for each of them made the other to profit. Their friendship was not recently begun. He well knew the old Aesculapius, and Dioscorides, and also Rufus, old Hippocrates, Haley, and Galen, Serapion, Rosas, and Avicenna, Averroes, John the Demoscan, and Constantine, Bernard, and Gaddesden, and Gilbertus. He was moderate in his diet, for it was of no excess, but greatly nourishing and digestible. His study was but little on the Bible. He was clad all in red and in blue, lined with taffeta and with silk, and yet he was moderate in spending. He kept what he earned in times of plague, since in medicine gold is a restorative for the heart. Therefore he loved gold in particular. There was a good wife of beside Bath, but she was somewhat deaf, and that was a pity. She had such a skill in cloth making. She surpassed them of Ypres and of Ghent. In all the parish there was no wife who should go to the offering before her, and if there did, certainly she was so angry that she was out of all charity, love for her neighbour. Her kerchiefs were very fine in texture. I dare swear they weighed 10 pound, that on a Sunday were upon her head. Her stockings were of fine scarlet red, very closely laced, and shoes very supple and new. Bold was her face, and fair, and red of hue. She was a worthy woman all her life. She had married 5 husbands at the church door, not counting other company in youth. But there is no need to speak of that right now. And she had been 3 times at Jerusalem. She had passed many a foreign sea. She had been at Rome, and at Boulogne, in Galicia at St. James of Compostela, and at Cologne. She knew much about wandering by the way. She had teeth widely set apart, truly to say. She sat easily upon a pacing horse, wearing a large wimple, and on her head a hat, as broad as a buckler or a shield, an overskirt about her large hips, and on her feet a pair of sharp spurs. In fellowship she well knew how to laugh and chatter. She knew, as it happened, about remedies for love, for she knew the old dance, tricks of the trade, of that art. A good man was there of religion, and he was a poor parson of a town, but he was rich in holy thought and work. He was also a learned man, a scholar, who would preach Christ's gospel truly. He would devoutly teach his parishioners. He was gracious, and wonderfully diligent, and very patient in adversity, and such he was proven many times. He was very reluctant to excommunicate for non-payment of his tithes, but rather would he give, there is no doubt, unto his poor parishioners about some of his offering, received at Mass, and also some of his income. He knew how to have sufficiency in few possessions. His parish was wide, and houses far apart, but he did not omit, for rain nor thunder, in sickness or in trouble to visit those living farthest away in his parish, high-ranking and low. going by foot, and in his hand a staff. He gave this noble example to his sheep. That first he wrought, and afterward he taught. He took those words out of the gospel, and this metaphor he added also to that. That if gold rust, what must iron do? For if a priest, on whom we trust, should be foul, it is no wonder for a layman to go bad. And it is a shame, if a priest is concerned. A shit-stained shepherd and a clean sheep. Well ought a priest to give an example, by his purity, how his sheep should live. He did not rent out his benefice, ecclesiastical living, and leave his sheep encumbered in the mire, and run to London unto St. Paul's, to seek an appointment as a chantry priest, praying for a patron, or to be hired, as a chaplain, by a guild, but dwelt at home, and kept well his sheepfold, parish, so that the wolf did not make it go wrong. He was a shepherd and not a hireling. And though he was holy and virtuous, he was not scornful to sinful men, nor domineering nor haughty in his speech, but in his teaching courteous and kind, to draw folk to heaven by gentleness, by good example. This was his business, unless it were an obstinate person, whoever he was, of high or low rank, he would rebuke him sharply at that time. I believe that nowhere is there a better priest. He expected no pomp and ceremony, nor made himself an overly fastidious conscience, but Christ's teaching and his 12 apostles. He taught, but first he followed it himself. With him there was a plowman, who was his brother, who had hauled very many a cartload of dung. He was a true and good worker, living in peace and perfect love. He loved God best with all his whole heart, at all times, whether it pleased or pained him. And then, he loved his neighbor exactly as himself. He would thresh, and moreover make ditches and dig, for Christ's sake, for every poor person, without payment, if it lay in his power. He paid his tithes completely and well, both of his own labor and of his possessions. He rode in a tabard, sleeveless jacket, upon a mare. There was also a reeve, and a miller, a summoner, and a pardoner also, a manciple, and myself. There were no more. The miller was a stout fellow indeed. He was very strong of muscle, and also of bones. That was well proven, for wherever he came, at wrestling he would always take the prize. He was stoutly built, broad, a large-framed fellow. There was no door that he would not heave off its hinges, or break it by running at it with his head. His beard was red as any sow or fox, and moreover broad, as though it were a spade. Upon the exact top of his nose he had a wart, and thereon stood a tuft of hairs, red as the bristles of a sow's ears. His nostrils were black and wide. He wore a sword and a buckler by his side. His mouth was as large as a large furnace. He was a loud mouth, and a buffoon. And that was mostly of sin and deeds of harlotry. He well knew how to steal corn and take payment 3 times. And yet he had a thumb of gold, indeed. He wore a white coat, and a blue hood. He well knew how to blow and play a bagpipe. And with that he brought us out of town. There was a fine manciple of a temple, law school, of whom buyers of provisions might take example, for how to be wise in buying of victuals. For whether he paid, cash, or took, goods, on credit, always he watched so, carefully for his opportunity, in his purchases, that he was always ahead and in good state. Now is not that a very fair grace of God, that such an unlearned man's which shall surpass the wisdom of a heap of learned men. He had more than 3 times 10 masters, who were expert and skilful in law, of whom there were a dozen in that house, worthy to be stewards of rent and land, of any lord that is in England, to make him live by his own wealth, in honor and debtless, unless he were crazy, or live as economically as it pleased him to desire. And they would be able to help all a shire, in any emergency that might occur or happen. And yet this manciple fooled them all. The reeve was a slender choleric man. His beard was shaved as close as ever he can. His hair was closely cropped by his ears. The top of his head in front was cut short like a priest's. His legs were very long and very lean. Like a stick, there was no calf to be seen. He well knew how to keep a granary, and a storage bin. There was no auditor who could earn anything by catching him. He well knew by the drought and by the rain what would be the yield of his seed and of his grain. His lord's sheep, his cattle, his herd of dairy cows, his swine, his horses, his livestock, and his poultry, was wholly in this reeve's control, and in accord with his contract he gave the reckoning. Since his lord was 20 years of age, there was no man who could find him in arrears. There was no farm manager, nor herdsman, nor other servant, whose trickery and treachery he did not know. They were afraid of him as of the plague. His dwelling was very nicely situated upon an heath. His place was shaded by green trees. He could buy property better than his lord could. He was secretly very richly provided. He well knew how to please his lord subtly, by giving and lending him some of his lord's own possessions, and have thanks, and also a coat and hood, as a reward. In youth he had learned a good craft. He was a very good craftsman, a carpenter. This reeve sat upon a very good horse, that was all dapple grey, and was called Scott. He had on a long outer coat of dark blue, and by his side he wore a rusty sword. Of Norfolk was this reeve of whom I tell, near to a town men call Bortswell. He had his coat hitched up and belted, like a friar, and ever he rode as the last of our company. There was a summoner with us in that place, who had a fire-edged cherubim's face, for it was pimpled and discoloured, with swollen eyelids. He was as hot and lecherous as a sparrow, with black, scabby brows and a beard with hair fallen out. Children were afraid of his face. There was no mercury, lead monoxide, nor sulphur, borax, white lead, nor any oil of tartar, nor ointment that would cleanse and burn, that could cure him of his white pustules, nor of the knobs sitting on his cheeks. He well loved garlic, onions, and also leeks, and to drink strong wine, red as blood. Then he would speak and cry out as if he were crazy. And when he had drunk deeply of the wine, then he would speak no word but Latin. He had a few legal terms, 2 or 3, that he had learned out of some text of ecclesiastical law. That is no wonder, he heard it all the day. And also you know well how a jay can call out Walter as well as the Pope can. But whoever knew how to examine him in other matters, would find that he had used up all his learning. Always the question is, what point of the law applies? He would cry. He was a fine rascal and a kind one. One could not find a better fellow. For a quart of wine he would allow a good fellow to have his concubine for 12 months, and excuse him completely. Secretly he also knew how to pull off a clever trick, and if he found anywhere a good fellow, he would teach him to have no awe of the archdeacon's curse, of excommunication, in such a case, unless a man's soul were in his purse, for in his purse he would be punished. Purse is the archdeacon's hell, he said. But well I know he lied right certainly. Each guilty man ought to be afraid of excommunication, for excommunication will slay just as forgiveness saves. And let him also beware of a significavit, order for imprisonment. In his control he had as he pleased the young people of the diocese, and knew their secrets, and was the adviser of them all. He had set a garland upon his head, as large as if it were for the sign of a tavern. He had made himself a shield of a cake. With him there rode a fine pardoner, of Roncesvalles, his friend and his companion, who had come straight from the court of Rome. Very loud he sang "Come hither, love, to me." This summoner harmonized with him in a strong bass. There was never a trumpet of half so great a sound. This pardoner had hair as yellow as wax, but smooth it hung as does a clump of flax. By small strands hung such locks as he had, and he spread them over his shoulders. But thin it lay, by strands one by one. But to make an attractive appearance, he wore no hood, for it was trussed up in his knapsack. It seemed to him that he rode in the very latest style. With hair unbound, save for his cap, he rode all bareheaded. He had glaring eyes such as a hare. He had sewn a veronica upon his cap. Before him in his lap, he had his knapsack, brimful of pardons come all fresh from Rome. He had a voice as tall as a goat has. He had no beard, nor never would have it. His face was as smooth as if it were recently shaven. I believe he was a eunuch or a homosexual. But as to his craft, from Berwick to Ware, there was no other pardoner like him. For in his pouch he had a pillow case, which he said was Our Lady's veil. He said he had a piece of the sail that St. Peter had, when he went upon the sea, until Jesus Christ took him. He had a cross of latten, brass-like alloy, covered with stones. And in a glass container he had pig's bones. But with these relics, when he found a poor parson dwelling in the countryside, in one day he got himself more money than the parson got in 2 months. And thus, with feigned flattery and tricks, he made fools of the parson and the people. But truly to tell at the last, he was in church a noble ecclesiast. He well knew how to read a lesson or a story. But best of all he sang an offertory. For he knew well, when that song was sung, he must preach and well smooth his speech, to win silver, as he very well knew how. Therefore he sang the more merrily and loud. Now have I told you truly, briefly, the rank, the dress, the number, and also the cause, why this company was assembled in Southwark at this fine hostelry, that is called the Tabard, close by the Bell. But now it is time to tell to you how we conducted ourselves that same night, when we had arrived in that hostelry, and after that I will tell of our journey, and all the rest of our pilgrimage. But first I pray you, of your courtesy, that you do not attribute it to my rudeness, though I speak plainly in this matter, to tell you their words and their behavior, nor though I speak their words accurately, for this you know as well as I. Whoever must repeat a story after someone, he must repeat as closely as ever he knows how, every single word, if it be in his power, although he may speak ever so rudely and freely, or else he must tell his tale inaccurately, or make up things or find new words. He may not refrain from telling the truth, although he were his brother. He must as well say one word as another. Christ himself spoke very plainly in Holy Writ, and you know well it is no rudeness. Also Plato says, whosoever knows how to read him, the words must be closely related to the deed. Also I pray you to forgive it to me, although I have not set folk in order of their rank, here in this tale, as they should stand. My wit is short, you can well understand. Our host made great hospitality to every one of us, and to the supper he set us straightway. He served us with victuals of the best sort. The wine was strong, and it well pleased us to drink. Our host was an impressive man indeed, qualified to be a master of ceremonies in a hall. He was a large man with prominent eyes. There was no better business man in Cheapside, bold of his speech, and wise, and well-mannered. And he lacked nothing at all of the qualities proper to a man. Also moreover he was a right merry man. And after supper he began to be merry, and spoke of mirth among other things. When we had paid our bills, and said thus, now, gentlemen, truly, you are right heartily welcome to me. For by my word, if I shall not lie, I must say, I saw not this year so merry a company, at one time in this lodging as is, here, now. I would gladly make you happy, if I knew how, and I have just now thought of an amusement, to give you pleasure, and it shall cost nothing. You go to Canterbury, God give you success. May the blessed martyr give you your reward. And well I know, as you go by the way, you intend to tell tales and to amuse yourselves. For truly, it is no comfort nor mirth, to ride by the way dumb as a stone. And therefore I will make a game for you, as I said before, and provide you some pleasure, and if pleases you all unanimously, to be subject to my judgment, and to do as I shall tell you, tomorrow, when you ride by the way. Now, by the soul of my father who is dead, unless you be merry, I will give you my head. Hold up your hands, without more speech. Our decision was not long to seek out. It seemed to us it was not worth while to deliberate on it. And, we, granted his request without more discussion, and asked him to say his decision as it pleased him. Gentlemen, said he, now listen for the best course of action. But, I pray you, do not take it in disdain, scorn it. This is the point, to speak briefly and clearly, that each of you, to make our way seem short by this means, must tell 2 tales in this journey. On the way to Canterbury, that is what I mean. And on the homeward trip he shall tell 2 others, about adventures that in old times have happened. And whoever of you who does best of all, that is to say, who tells in this case, tales of best moral meaning and most pleasure, shall have a supper at the cost of us all, here in this place, sitting by this post, when we come back from Canterbury. And to make you the more merry, I will myself gladly ride with you, entirely at my own cost, and be your guide. And whosoever will not accept my judgment, shall pay all that we spend by the way. And if you grant that it be so, tell me straightway, without more words, and I will get ready early for this. This thing was granted, and our oaths sworn, with very glad hearts, and we prayed him also, that he would consent to do so, and that he would be our governor, and judge and scorekeeper of our tales, and set us supper at a certain price, and we will be ruled as he wishes, in every respect, and thus unanimously, we are accorded to his judgment. And thereupon the wine was fetched immediately, we drank, and each one went to rest, without any longer tarrying. In the morning, when day began to spring, our host arose, and was the rooster of us all, awakened us, and gathered us together all in a flock, and forth we rode at little more than a walk, unto the watering of St. Thomas. And there our host stopped his horse, and said, Gentlemen, listen, if you please. You know your agreement, and I remind you of it. If what you said last night agrees with what you say this morning, let's see now who shall tell the first tale. As ever I may drink wine or ale, whosoever may be rebel to my judgment, shall pay for all that is spent by the way. Now draw straws, before we depart further, from London. He who has the shortest shall begin. Sir Knight, said he, my master and my lord, now draw a straw, for that is my decision. Come nearer, he said, my lady prioress. And you, Sir Clerk, let be your modesty. And study not, lay hand to, draw a straw, every man. Every person began straightway to draw, and shortly to tell as it was. Were it by chance, or destiny, or luck? The truth is this, the draw fell to the knight, for which everyone was very happy and glad. And he must tell his tale, as was reasonable, by our previous promise and by formal agreement. As you have heard, what more words are needed? And when this good man saw that it was so, like one who was wise and obedient, to keep his agreement by his free assent, he said, Since I must begin the game, what? Welcome be the draw, in God's name. Now let us ride, and listen to what I say. And with that word we rode forth on our way. And he began with a truly merry demeanour, to tell his tale straightway, and said as you may hear.